Oracle of the Forgotten, the Humans, an introduction. Humans, what are they? Where did they come from? Wrath seemed to be the best resource. Although he was still making a name for himself in the many realms, his appearance was hidden behind armor and blade. The Elder had, however, found time to study, especially anything that he might be able to host in an arena that he was already in the process of building. Humans? Of course they were the great mystery. None of the ancients nor younger gods knew who made them. None of the races seemed to know much of anything about them. The only thing that Wrath had managed to uncover is that they were born with innate magic. In fact, some of them even had extremely powerful hidden magic. While suspicious of their actual origins, he noticed something in his master that made him silence his questioning of the Destroyer's knowledge. Somehow Wrath felt that despite his friend's questions, there was something more there to uncover. A simple glance told him that it was not his place to ask. If his friend had chosen to test him, then this would be something he would have to learn on his own. As for humanity, at this time they were in the early stages of uncovering their power. As near as records could show, humans themselves only had around 10,000 years of known history, even in their own records. They developed quickly, partially due to intervention by younger gods who had enjoyed experimenting with teaching the little things. In early days, it was basic tool-making, farming, and survival skills. The first human world had 2 moons, a consistently present sun, and the occasionally appearing second sun that seemed to swing by the edges of their solar system enough to light the world every 4,000 to 6,000 years, by their measurements. This created a land around the center of the world they called the Scorched Lands. Blazing deserts that were near impossible to cross during the time of the 2 suns. They were a hazard even during the best of times. When the 2 suns would come, the world would shake, causing chaos in the lands. The 2 sides of the world hardly had contact. The occasional trader or explorer would find a way from one side to the other. Rumors of outposts that offered safety in the Scorched Lands were occasionally heard, but very rarely did anyone hear of an actual person traveling across them. The few traders and adventurers who did were often treated with a great deal of respect. Even when on the oceans, traveling past the region of the Scorched Lands is dangerous. The waters would boil and swallow ships whole. They still hadn't even developed boats when the gods first became aware of them. Basic boats were among the simple tools they had been taught to use. While most races were gifted their names, humans had named themselves. When the gods first came to see them, they'd found a strange race with the most simple forms of language and technology. Still, there was something about them that was different from the many creatures in the new universe. For whatever reason, it seemed impossible to place. They were strong-willed and showed some exceptional potential for magic and warfare. They were often found to be building, creating, and even growing beyond what they were being taught. The humans were strong, capable, and despite their shorter lives, learned and adapted extremely quickly. This, of course, made them ideal servants and guardians. They could be taught their roles easily, and the gods believed that they would not survive long enough to truly become a problem for them. The gods taught them basic machinery, weapons, simple armors, and technologies, yet still kept them far behind their own. As transportation levels increased, the gods began teaching the humans farming, production, and all manner of useful skills. They taught them to make the tools required to perform their work. At this point, they had developed a decent level of technology, allowing them to build large structures, wagons for transport, and even a decent force to travel the oceans of their world. At first, it seemed like a benevolent venture, but the gods had already decided what to do with the humans. As the races developed different forms of magic, the gods taught them to only use those that were favorable to their own needs. Humanity had quickly been turned from a race of free people into servants in only a few thousand years. While many seemed to favor the directions by the gods, other problems began to arise. The gods began to take advantage of their power. Thinking the humans weak and small, they began to use them in any way that pleased them, whether or not the humans were willing participants in their games. They set themselves as kings, lording over the humans. Some gods would starve their servants, others stealing away their women. Some hunted them for sport or took their supplies and left them with only the most meager measures of food and clothing and shelter. Humanity seemed to have no way to fight back, until one day, everything changed. Despite his best efforts, one of the gods could not get his female servant to show even the smallest sign of interest in him. He'd offered her the same thing as so many others: power, wealth, riches, food. None of it seemed to draw her attention. He was tired of her resistance. After all, she was just a woman. Humans were weak, or so he thought. She fought back against his attempts to take her from where she was working. The sound drew the mortal, who was considered to be her husband. No one fully knows what happened, only that some point along the three fighting, the god was destroyed. Not just killed. No, gods lost their incarnations fairly often. This one simply stopped existing. The event shattered the very understanding of humans. Since the elders disappeared, none had been able to put a final end to any of their kind. The gods could only assume some sort of terrible magic was involved in his death. They began to capture humans. Their laws became more strict than the ones before. They convinced the mortals that the ones with the magic were dangerous. Turn in anyone who has magic. They were corrupted by the forces of darkness. They are evil, and they could turn at any moment on your loved ones. Many fell for the deception. Some resisted. During this time, the humans who had killed the lost god were building their own kingdom. Not that they wanted to lead. They wanted to protect their friends and loved ones. These two humans began to bring in other humans that would rise up against the gods. Together, they built up a strong force that could hold its own against this corruption. The castle they were using was the same that had belonged to their former master. As the armies began to build, the gods began to grow wary of the impending forces of these mortals. The humans marched, slowly casting out each of the gods in their realms in an uprising like no other the ancients had ever experienced. During the last of those days, the eldest son of the king was born, a small infant with white hair, much like his parents. This inherited trait would also become the target for the few gods remaining in the human lands. With no idea for the cause of these abilities, the gods declared that all white-haired humans were to be treated as outsiders. They were dangerous and will eventually fall to corruption as well. Humanity fought back, and all that was left of the gods was a single temple that began to call themselves the New Order. The humans in those regions had lived well in their times, but with the sudden changes in rules and the constant force of the New Order telling them that they couldn't trust their own neighbors, the hunts began. Those with magic were either captured or killed, dragged into the streets where they were beaten for their corruption before being turned over to the Order. These dark times had led to many going into hiding to preserve themselves against the onslaught of strange forces from what was now quickly being called a dark cult by the locals. Before long, the human king and queen created something they called the Old Church. At least, that's how it would translate in modern language. The Old Church offered rest, sanctuary, even protection from those who would come in to harm the humans who were there. They called the gods beings to learn from rather than creatures to worship and give undying respect. They said humanity as a whole should respect and protect one another. Not just a place of words, the Old Church protected both those with magic and those without from the forces of non-humans outside their walls. The Old Church often used their own guards or the town guard to fight back against attacks from the New Order. Despite that effort, both orders began to spread through the land, the hope of the humans and the fear of the gods. While things seemed to settle down as the powers balanced themselves out, a new risk came to surface. The king's child was stolen away in the night, and the king and queen left the lands with only a single order: do not let them take back control. The kingdom grew as the pair began their passage, cutting down hordes of beasts, strange entities, the order, and anything that dared stand in their way. While they were away, the kingdom began to change. The rules of accepting others had mostly remained, but a few factions were growing within their realms. The ideas of equality and freedom had already been tainted by the time they spent with the gods, and it wasn't long before humans were creating their own groups of slaves and slave trades, despite the orders of their king and queen. News of these changes would never reach the pair. As they traveled to their final destination in the void, they only knew the story they'd been told. The god of the void had stolen a child who belonged to the kings of gods, and they wanted it back. In exchange, the two would receive back their son. The two knew it could all be a trick, but they still carved their path. Her great sword took down enemy after enemy along the way. His twin blades did the rest of the work. They weren't much smaller, being great swords themselves, but he'd learned to wield them with the same efficiency as most men could a smaller blade. The two were a force to be reckoned with. The gods had sent them out, hoping it would be their end. After all, they knew what the god of the void truly was. Years passed when suddenly a young man came back to the human kingdom claiming to be their king's son. The people's memories had faded some, but the boy certainly looked like his father. Having the same name as the missing child and explaining that he'd been abducted by magical humans as a way to manipulate the kingdom was enough for many who had been hearing the constant whispering of the order about their fellow man. He took over rule of the human lands, but his position was far from kind. In fact, he was quite quick to change the rules. He started with the rules to protect the people, rounding up the few who could still use magic to be moved to a protective land far from the place that normal humans would dwell. When asked, he would show scars of magical burns along one side of his body as proof that magical humans had, indeed, intended to enslave and destroy their people through the removing of their kings. Under a false claim of protecting the people, he took those who showed any sign of unnatural power, put them into wagons, and sent them away to a place that the rest of their kin would hopefully never learn the horrors of. The new king was swift to divide the people. He told the humans who showed no sign of magic how they were chosen by the gods as the powerful and elite. He told them time and again that the magical people were corrupt, tainted by other races that had seduced their people for their own purposes. He told them the gods had saved him from the magical beings who convinced his parents to allow them to take over these lands. It didn't take long to sway the people into suppressing all of the magic, whether by hiding them away or denying them entirely. The few who still dared to use such powers were outcasts. Before long, the new king had established the new order as the main faith in the realm. The people fled the capital city, moving further and further across the lands. They weren't sure how to seek more freedom, with the new order following closely behind them. Before long, the leaders of the old church began to fall, each being charged with crimes relating to hiding the outcasts and working with non-humans. Still, the forces of the freedom seekers grew as quickly as they were cut down. Humanity longed for freedom. Those with magic took up refuge in the empty buildings of the old church, creating safe houses that the order could no longer enter. These became a set of stops that humans took while preparing to spread out and seek their freedom from the already growing oppression of the crown. It was close to 20 years after the rise of the new king that things began to truly change. A human child raised in the deep parts of the wilderness began to fight against slave traders raiding his small village. He had lived a simple life, working, training to fight, and studying what his adopted mother called the elder laws. He'd been sent to the woods to clear feral beasts when he began to smell smoke in the distance. At first, he felt it was no concern, but as the scent grew stronger, the smoke began to flow into the woods themselves. The man ran back towards his village, not expecting to find it razed by raiders and burnt to the ground. He wasn't certain if his adopted mother had been captured or killed, only that she and many of his friends had disappeared at the same time from his home. All of the women and children were either gone or left for dead in the fields next to the weapons they had tried to fight back with. The young man was horrified by the sight. His own sense of honor seemed to drive him into a slowly burning and growing rage. He ran a hand through his white hair, pulling himself together a moment before grabbing the blade he held so dearly. A gift, the last remaining emblem of his own birth mother. He followed the trail of raiders, hoping to find out where they'd come from and why. When he attacked their camp, he learned that they were running slave rings. His own people had only been the most recent targets. This only fueled his anger as he began following these slave trades back towards their source. He trailed the few survivors that he'd intentionally left, hoping they would lead him deeper into corruption. He'd learned most of the slaves of his village were sent through the temples of the New Order, all the way back to the heart of the kingdom. Some were said to even be slaves to the king himself. The king. His mother had warned him about the rising king, that he was no ally to humanity, but she didn't know much about him. Only small flickers of information she could gather when her power wasn't completely drained with trying to sustain herself and care for the injured in their village. He knew her as a warrior, a seer, and a protector of the village. Part of him doubted if she was even alive after these attacks, but he knew if she would be waiting for the perfect time to strike back. The man started his journey back to the kingdom, determined to put an end to the cruelty in his own lands, and entirely unaware of what he would face along the way. A long road of fighting other beings, demons, beasts, and even his own kind led him back to where he found the king. When the two met, they were shocked to find how similar they looked. One was riddled with scars and injuries, the other covered in oils and fine linens. The two were quite alike in many physical ways. The king was also known to be a great warrior. Unlike his parents, he had chosen two short blades to wield in battle. His fighting style was taught to him by the guardians the council had given him when he was young. The two fought for hours, day drifting into the night, and soon the light of dawn nearly upon the horizon. They were both badly injured when the king called his guards to step in. Despite the interruption, the white-haired stranger managed to cut down all the guards before raising his blade to the king again. A large blade that held upon the hilt the crest of the kingdom itself. the blade that had once belonged to the fallen queen. Unknown to the stranger, but all too familiar to the king standing across from him. The king flew into a rage, demanding the sword before renewing his attacks. After all, it belonged to the kingdom, not some fool peasant who'd wandered into their lands seeking to overthrow him. The stranger mostly ignored the banter, allowing him to focus his final strikes before removing the king who had terrorized his people. To demand the blade of his mother was new, but not too convincing to the young man who fought him. As the wanderer cut through the king, he looked at the castle that had once belonged to the god themselves. The ground shook a moment, not even throwing the mortal off balance, but knocking the remnants of the king to the dirt. A messenger came forward, demanding that he choose if he wishes to follow the will of the council or be destroyed. This messenger was a large man, 6 wings upon his back, and glowing circles of light surrounding his entire form. It was a creature humans hadn't yet encountered, and yet the mortal seemed entirely unfazed. Rather than allowing the creature to command him, he began to ask questions. After some time, he even began to learn the truth. The man he had just killed was his brother, and he was now the new king. The blade he held was from the fallen queen, left behind in some unknown land. If anything, the messenger had seemed curious how he found it. The messenger himself received no real answers, though. If his adopted mother was anywhere in these worlds, she'd earned the respect of his silence. This council, whatever it was, had ordered his brother to create this hell for his people. It needed stopped. It had created a world where those who were different were tracked, hunted, enslaved, or even killed for not being like the others. This all needed a resolution. When the messenger asked again that the stranger make his choice, now with all the information in hand, the stranger answered in a way that no one would have predicted. Like his father before him, he cut the immortal to the ground, removing every bit of life from his form. An eternal end, the same fate that the councils had sought to stop with their meddling in the lives of mankind. They would not have ties to anyone who would manipulate or harm them, not any longer. He also learned that his brother had a young son, the perfect candidate for the throne if he was raised properly. The warrior only stayed long enough to raise the boy, teaching him the same ways he'd been raised, to defend the balance, to protect the people, and to live with honor. He used the time to try to abolish slavery and illicit practices that had ruined his own homeland. It took decades, not that it mattered. In these days, humans lived long lives. The members of the New Order were rounded up and banished to the fertile lands on the opposite side of the scorched lands, where it was hoped they would live their own ways in peace and leave the people here alone. Once he felt the new kingdom was safe in the hands of this young king, he started his next quest. This time, against the gods and the council that had corrupted his lands.